Now, Mr. President, many of us in 2022 were here when Barbados had and played host to the very first Africa Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum. We called it ACTIV, anecdotally. It was held here in Barbados in 2022 at the LASC, and we had representatives from the CARICOM region and the Africa region come together over the course of several days for this trade and investment conference. In 2023, ACTIV moved from Barbados, and it was held then in Guyana in June. And Mr. President, in April of 2023 then, after the Barbados conference and even before the Guyana conference, the board of directors of the Africa Exim Bank made a decision. And they made a decision that was reflective of the spirit within which ACTIV itself was conceived and hosted. That decision was that they would have a memorandum of understanding between the two regions, between the CARICOM region and the African region, and that memorandum of understanding would serve to deepen, the relationships between the two regions. It would serve to deepen the relationship between the two regions. And as we deepen the relationship between the two regions, Mr. President, we would implement and give effect to a long sought after goal of closing the gap between the African region and the Caribbean region. Mr. President, it is no secret, and I've spoken about it before, that in a previous life, under the umbrella of the CARICOM Secretariat, I had the distinction of serving as the trade policy advisor to the East African region. In that capacity, Mr. President, I had the opportunity to participate in a series of negotiations. One, the creation of the East African Community Common Market, which I've spoken about before. I've spoken about it in this chamber where I said that when I arrived in Uganda to be based in Kampala, they were already deep in negotiations with the East African community on the creation of an East African Community Common Market. And lo and behold, to my excitement and subsequently my consternation, they were using the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas to create it. They were using the Caribbean community's own instruments of our own regional integration movement to create an East African community and a common market. I was then able to see and participate in those negotiations for the launch of an East African Common Market, and then the consternation came when later I was able to see this region that modeled their common market after ours come and surpass the deepening of their regional integration movement in ways that we had talked about but had not in this region implemented. And so, Mr. President, the relationship then evolved beyond just the common market for East Africa, but we then saw the conversations around the negotiation of an interim trade agreement between the African region of the East African region and that with West Africa as well, Mr. President, and then a South African sub-region and the European Union with interim economic partnership agreements, having already negotiated with the Caribbean in 2008 an economic partnership agreement. And then it went on, Mr. President. It was in that framing that the All Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement negotiations commenced. And the African continent at that time coalesced around itself in those discussions around how to deepen the trade and investment relationship among the 52 countries that were represented on the continent. How we as a region now, Mr. President, interface as CARICOM with those 52 member states perhaps could not be more important in this geopolitical context than ever before. And so, Mr. President, the relationship between the African continent and the Caribbean region has long been talked about. When we then in turn had an economic partnership agreement with Europe, Africa was negotiating in their sub-regional movements their own economic partnership agreements. The discussion around forging a deeper and a closer relationship with the CARICOM region also evolved. what would and should that relationship look like? To date, we have not signed a trade agreement with the African countries, and in the post-2008 period, there was an extensive debate around what we in the trade community call the spaghetti bowl of international trade agreements. Who are all these countries forging trade agreements with? What is contained within these trade agreements? Is it services? Is it goods? Is it investment? Is it financial services? Is it intellectual property? What does it look like? And we in the Caribbean region then did not and have not yet moved any further since the 2008 negotiation with the European Union, and then subsequently the UK Economic Partnership Agreement post-Brexit. We had that agreement. And so here came the African continent to say, look, we talked about this thing for a long time. We've been talking about deepening relationships for a long time. We don't have an agreement, but what are we going to do? And so ACTIV came about in 2012 as the first opportunity for the African continent to be here with Barbados and with CARICOM to begin to explore the modalities of what that would look like. What could it look like to forge that deeper relationship? It's fine to say that we established diplomatic relations, Mr. President, in what year, and that we've enjoyed long and cordial relationships over a number of years, Mr. President. It's fine to say that we're having an exchange of visits, and I remember being a young Foreign Service officer and having an official visit from places like Botswana come to Barbados and visit. And we've had the President of Kenya, they've come to visit, but what of it? What have we done at an institutional level to make and to give effect to the substantive relationships that political relationships have opened the doors for? What have been the economic, the commercial, the financial, the trade, the logistics, and the investment ties? What have we done? And so, Mr. President, there can be no question about it that the signature of a memorandum of understanding between the CARICOM region, 10 of the 15 member countries signed on to this memorandum of understanding and made a commitment to forging a technical relationship in the area of trade and investment, even without a trade agreement, Mr. President, even without it. That was done in 2023, Mr. President. And without wasting any further time, that was in April of 2023 when it was approved at the Board of Directors level, without wasting any further time, by August, the 4th of August, here in Barbados, we all witnessed, and it was publicly broadcast as well, between where its offices are located on the South Coast and then the Barbados Hilton, where the ceremony actually took place, the signature and the launch of the Barbados, of the CARICOM based in Barbados, Africa Exim Bank headquarters office. That began in 2023. Coming out of that launch in 2023 in August, Mr. President, the president of the Africa Exim Bank was here at the time, along with several leaders from across the region. And at the time they pledged to make available to this region, the 10 countries that had signed on to the MOU, 1.5 billion, with a B, in resources available to the CARICOM countries. $1.5 billion in a credit limit made available to finance projects in the Caribbean region. Projects that focus, Mr. President, specifically on things like trade infrastructure, investment in MSMEs, and sectoral projects in different countries. We've seen projects evolving in Guyana, we've seen projects evolving in Grenada. The intention stated at that time, Mr. President, was that within a few years, the expectation was that the $1.5 billion was meant to be increased to $3 billion over time. In February, now, fast forward, I'm showing the timeline, in February now of this year, just the other day, when the CARICOM Heads of Government meeting took place right here in Barbados again, the president of the Africa Exim Bank was here. And he announced that within the space of just a year and a half, the Africa Exim Bank had made the determination that they were going to reach $2.5 billion in trade and investment credit limits for the CARICOM region, the countries that were vested here, Mr. President. And so there is no question at all, that the CARICOM region is now putting into implementation mode that which has been philosophically talked about for a really long time. For a really long time. And let it be clear also, Mr. President, that the Africa Export-Import Bank is not an entity that the government just randomly went and picked up and found somewhere and decided that we're going to go and tell the public that there's somebody that they're not, Mr. President. This is a bank that has been functioning for over 30 years. Over 30 years. It has assets that stand at in excess of US 31 billion with a B. It has shareholder funds that amount to somewhere in the vicinity of 5.2 billion with a B. And it is making available to the CARICOM region up to $3 million in the initial investment with a B, Mr. President. This is the entity that has been set up, but I go a little bit further, Mr. President. When that first visit took place, not only did they offer what I have shared, but it was reciprocal. So Barbados and the CARICOM region have the option of taking advantage of the generous offer by the Africa Export-Import Bank in their offices in Cairo, in their offices in any other country, to house offices of the CARICOM region, where we would then in turn have officers not just from Barbados, but from the CARICOM region to be in a position to engage on the outbound side. So they are here, and the ambition is for us to also be there. That's what is intended. So what is expected then, Mr. President, for them to do with this portion of land? It is expected that on this portion of land, there will be the construction of a trade facility, which is equivalent to what they have done in every other jurisdiction where they have set up headquarters offices. Mr. President, this is not just a matter of coming to put up a building. It is about the commercial and the economic activity that comes as a consequence, the construction costs, local, the jobs that will be coming as a consequence of the construction, local. The creation, Mr. President, which is a long-held ambition across administrations, to the best of my knowledge, for Barbados to serve as a regional hub for international and regional organizations. That is not new either. So it is a little bit concerning that this thing is being turned into something, again, which it is not. Barbados and the Eastern Barbados is the home for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean of the Inter-American Development Bank. It is the home for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean of the European delegation. Barbados is the home and the hub for the entire region of UN House. Kofi Annan came here and opened it himself. Barbados is the home for the region, and we have heard in another contribution where Senator Nichols spoke about the circumstances under which the Caribbean Development Bank was given land to establish the headquarters that we see currently up in the Pine and Wildy. Mr. President, the Caribbean Development Bank exists in Baobab Towers, Mr. President. As a matter of fact, don't let me go to Baobab Towers yet. In my own office for the Ministry of Energy, the government, under every headquarters agreement that it has in place, provides office space for offices that are headquartered here. It is a function of our diplomatic relationship with the rest of the world. Barbados does not stand in splendid isolation, someone said recently, and it is the truth. Especially when there are benefits to be derived to the country and to the people, and when it implements a long-standing philosophical position of successive governments for Barbados to forge closer, deeper, and more meaningful relationships with the African continent. And so, Mr. President, I don't want to belabor this particular resolution. I have placed it in context, not just where it is or what it is doing, who the bank is, what the philosophy is that has guided it, but also Barbados' standing relationships with headquarters agreements for international and regional organizations that make Barbados their home, and in so doing, add value to our economy and to our people, create jobs and create opportunities, but also give us a platform to implement the things that we as a country have long talked about. In this incarnation, Mr. President, it is a long sought after, long described, closer trade and investment relationship with the 52 member states of the African continent. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this resolution do not pass.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Montreal-Worrell.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise to this vesting that we are here to do today. The government has placed us in this chamber in a rather peculiar situation, and not only us, but also all Barbadians, because throughout this country, we need to make two things clear. One, being against what the government is proposing now does not mean that you are against any further integration or association with our African brothers and sisters and their participation in this country. But the government has not given the people of Barbados sufficient information, and given the tone in this country, in particular the way how the land at Holetown, the Holetown Civic Center,